Hey everybody, it's me Stacy at Scrapbooking Made Simple here with another YouTube demo for you today. Today we're going to be working with inks, chalk ink, dye ink, and pigment ink. And I have to be really honest with you. When I opened my store, I didn't know anything about inks. We started online with dyes and I really didn't sell inks, but when I opened the retail stores, it was important that we get into ink, and it took me a long time to understand what a chalk ink was versus what a dye ink was versus what a pigment ink was, and what each of them did and why they were different from each other. I just saw that they all looked red to me, and if the color was red, why was one different than the other? But I finally did understand, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity for me to share some of that with you, because we still get a lot of questions as to what you can do with chalk ink, or do you have to use pigment ink to do this application? And I thought it would be just a great time to explain some of that. So we're going to scroll on down and get started, okay? Down we go. Bye. All right. I think we're pretty good there, don't you? That works for me. Now today we're going to start with chalk ink. I've got chalk ink, I've got dye ink, and I've got pigment ink. And chalk ink is the fastest drying of all of them. When you're thinking about inks, you have, again, chalk ink, C, dye ink, D, and pigment ink, P. So when you're thinking about inks and dry time, they dry in that order. Chalk ink dries the fastest. It's the first one. It's letter C. So chalk ink dries the fastest. Dye ink is letter D, comes after letter C, and it dries a little bit slower than your chalk ink. And then pigment ink is P, and that comes a long time after D, and it takes a long time to dry. So right now we're going to start with our chalk ink. And I've got the Hero Hues brand chalk ink. We have several chalk inks in the store. We love Hero Hues, and we also love our Colorbox, which is Clear Snap. Now, the difference between these two is this one's called a cat's eye, and this one's a full-size pad. When you hear a cat's eye reference, that's just talking about the shape of the pad. This is shaped like a cat's eye. You could have this color, which is Lagoon, in a full-size pad, but people get very confused about cat's eyes. And when you're talking about a cat's eye pad, it's just the shape. Cat's eyes come in all three. They come in chalk, they come in dye, and they come in pigment. So right now, the two we have are a full-size pad and a cat's eye pad, but they're both chalk inks. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stamp with chalk ink. I've got a Hero Arts stamp here, and I'm going to ink it on up. I inked my fingers at the same time, and I'm going to stamp with it. And chalk ink dries very fast. Remember I said it was the first letter, it's letter C, and it dries very fast. It gives a beautiful image, and when I run my fingers over it, it's already dry. Now because it is dried already, you cannot emboss it with embossing powder. The embossing powder will not stick to it. That's one of the reasons why scrapbookers and card makers love chalk ink so much, is because it dries really fast. There's no wait time. And yes, you absolutely can take your chalk ink and use it to distress your edges or whatever it is you want to do. Chalk ink is great for that too. But you can stamp with it. And I think that's one of the biggest questions we get. Can you stamp with chalk ink? Absolutely. It looks beautiful. There's no reason not to. Just remember that it dries really fast, so you can't go back and blend the colors. You can't go back and heat emboss over it. What you see is what you get. There's no opportunity to change or mix because it's already dry. Now, chalk inks come in, oh my gosh, Colorbox, I think, sells 49 different colors of chalk ink. And of course we have, I think, all of them. And they're a very easy size to handle, a very easy tool to handle because it is handheld. Chalk ink in this size is also very convenient because if you're not sure what colors you're going to like, this is a great size to play with. They're only $2, and it gives you the opportunity to see if you're going to enjoy that color or not. And then if you do, you can buy it in the full-size pad. I recommend on your full-size pads your basic colors. You should have a red, you should have a brown, you should have a black, because those are colors that you use often. And Hero Hues makes an amazing chalk ink. We really love it, and it's what we carry, one of the ones we carry here in the store. Now chalk ink is different than dye ink. And our dye ink of choice here is Memento. And one of the reasons why Memento is our choice of dye ink is because it is the ink that works best with Copic markers. You can stamp with this and then color with your Copic markers and not have any smearing. Now the difference is dye ink is letter D. It follows letter C. So it's going to dry a little bit slower than chalk if you do your ABCs. C comes before D. C is first. It dries fast. D is second. Takes a little bit more time. So when you're out shopping, if you remember your alphabet, you can remember which inks dry the fastest. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stamp with my Memento ink here. I'm going to take another Hero Art stamp here and ink it up. Now dye ink is pretty much your all-purpose ink. It's what you're going to use most of the time. Okay, and down we go. It gives a beautiful impression. It dries a little bit slower. See, if I take it, I don't know if you can see, but I can smear it. See, I could not do that with the chalk ink. It would not smear, but it's not smearing a lot. It dries fairly fast. Now what that means, again, is that embossing it with an embossing powder, it works, but not so good. It gives a very orange peel effect, and I have a sample here. I don't know if you can see. This is the Memento ink, and I threw embossing powder over the top of it, and then I heat set it. And it's got a very orange peely effect. And now if that's the effect you're going for and you like it, absolutely emboss over it. But it doesn't give that smooth, glossy, glassy finish you get when you use a pigment ink and you emboss with it. So dye ink dries fast, just not as fast as chalk ink. And it's dry now, it won't smudge now. So I'm going to stamp again because dye ink also has, or at least the Memento dye ink, also has a great bonus. Well, it's got several bonuses. One, you can use it with your Copics, which is awesome. Two, Memento has their own pens. And people say, well, why do I need to have the pens to go with my pads? Well, it's really simple. Let's say you made a mistake. Let's say you didn't stamp somewhere. It didn't fill in as much as you want to. The Memento pens match the ink beautifully, and you can go in and you can color. And you can fix your mistakes. To go in and try and restamp would be very, very difficult. So if I had little dots or dashes, or if my words didn't come out exactly right, I could go in and I could recolor this entire thing if I wanted to using my Memento pen. That's one of the biggest elements of the Memento colors, is that you get the pens along with the full-size pads, and they all work with your Copics. So, and Hero Arts also has the Hero Hues program in dye ink, and the Memento pens match the Hero Hues. So we always recommend that if you're going to have Memento full-size pads, which is what I've used right here, if we're going to have Memento full-size pads, you also have the marker to match. And that will allow you to go in and clean up any mistakes that you made. If you didn't get a great stamp, you can go in there and just touch up with the color that you've used. Now, the dye ink, like I said, is the most versatile. It's the one that most people go to because it dries very fast, but not as fast as the chalk ink. So you do have an opportunity to blend some of your colors, and I've done some of that before, where I've taken and wet them down and moved them around a little bit. And our favorite brand here is Memento. Then we have our pigment ink. Now, pigment ink is something completely different. It's a very, 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 very wet ink. It does not dry fast. It is, if you think about your C for chalk dries the fastest, your D for dye dries almost as fast as chalk, and then P. P is a long way from D. It takes pigment ink a long time to dry. And I am going to go ahead and ink up my stamp. Again, a great Hero Art stamp. I'm going to stamp with it. And it is very wet. Can you see the gloss coming off of that? It is a very wet stamp. This actually should be heat set. I am sure you could leave it out and let it dry, but ideally you're going to heat set this. If I take my finger, it just absolutely smudges. That's how wet the ink is. So what is this good for? This is awesome for your embossing with embossing powder or clear embossing powder, because that ink is wet enough to hold that embossing powder in place and have it melt into a beautiful glossy finish. And that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you a couple things to do with embossing powder. So quickly, we've got our chalk ink here, dried very, very fast. We've got a dye ink here that dried almost as fast, not quite as fast, but looks beautiful. And then we've got a pigment ink that takes time to dry and really should be heat set. Okay, I'm going to stamp again with my pigment ink, and pigment ink takes the longest to dry. So I'm going to stamp, and I'm going to use a clear embossing powder just so you can see what it looks like. I've got a clear embossing powder here. Put my card in, kind of brush it off over the top, and that's what I've got. I don't know if you can see the little bits of powder are on my stamp. Okay, and then we would heat set this to give a very nice finish. Now I'm going to do one on black, and I'm going to use another Hero Art stamp, and I'm going to take the pigment ink and I'm going to go ahead and stamp on black paper. And you're going to say, well, why are you using black ink to stamp on black paper? One of the benefits of pigment ink is that you can take a colored embossing powder, and it doesn't matter what color you've used to stamp with. You can see I've got my silhouette there, and she's in black. It doesn't matter if I used a green ink, a purple ink, a blue ink. If I'm going to use colored embossing powder, which is what I've got here, colored embossing powder, I'm going to put it onto my stamp. And then put it back into my pot. And then I would take my heat tool, and by the magic of TV, I have one already done. This is what I get from this. You would never know that I stamped with black ink underneath because that gold embossing powder totally covered it up. So I could have used purple ink or blue ink or green ink. So if you see a pigment ink on sale somewhere and you're going to want to do embossing with colored embossing powders, grab it, buy it. It doesn't matter what color it is because it's always going to work. It's always going to be covered up when you heat set with that colored embossing powder. Okay? And again, that's with your pigment ink. Pigment for P, it's the last one in the alphabet, and it takes the longest to dry. Okay. Then if we just wanted to go over the top of that black pigment ink, let's see. Oh, here we go. I have another Hero Art stamp. I'll just put it on the back. I'm going to ink it up. I would stamp with it. And then like I did before, I would cover it with my clear embossing powder. And heat set it. So it's now covered with clear embossing powder, and then I would heat set it. Now I did that on this card here, as I heat set with clear embossing powder the thanks. And can you see the gloss finish on that? I've now got clear embossing powder right over the top, and it gives it that raised wonderful feel. And that's just going with basic clear embossing powder over your pigment ink stamp. And it has to be pigment ink to get that glazy look, that glazy effect. So this card was done with the new Tim Holtz embossing folders that we have in stock. These just released. It's fabulous. I love them. This card was done using the pigment ink and a clear embossing powder. This card was done again using the pigment ink, but this time I used, just like I did on this one, I used silver embossing powder, and it covered up that black pigment ink. That silver covered it right up so you would never even know that there was black ink underneath there. And that's what you do with pigment ink. It's really for embossing. Otherwise, if you use it, you need to plan on heat setting. Okay, so what did we learn today? Ooh, it was very quick. We learned that chalk ink, which is this one right here, I did this one, chalk ink dries very, very fast. You can put your fingers right over it very, very quickly. Dries instantaneously. Not good for embossing powder, not good for blending, great for doing your edges, and really a fun ink to use for scrappers and card makers because it dries so fast that they can get their work done and move on. Love chalk ink. Comes in full-size pads, comes in cat's eye pads. Some companies even make them in mid-size pads. So chalk ink is a very usable ink, a very user-friendly ink. Then we have our dye ink, which I did this one with. Dye ink, memento ink. Very similar to a chalk ink. It dries fairly quickly. Yes, you can emboss it, but if you do emboss it, you are going to get that orange peely type of effect with it. It's not going to be nice and smooth like we've got on these two. It's going to be more of an orange peely type of effect, but you can emboss with it. Memento ink is a great dye ink. It also has the pens to go with it, so you can go back in there and touch up any mistakes that you have. And it can be used with your Copic markers. So that is a dye-based ink and probably the most usable ink out of all of them. And then last we have, of course, our pigment ink, the least user-friendly ink. It takes the longest to dry, and its main purpose is really for using embossing powder, whether it be clear embossing powder or colored embossing powder. And I've got those samples here. So I stamped here in green and put a clear embossing powder over the top of it, and here I stamped in black and put gold embossing powder over the top of it. So I hope you learned something today about inks, and you may want to go back and review this a couple times. It took me quite a while to learn all the different things that the inks can do. Thanks very much for joining me, and have a great day. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.